The blade flitted along his knuckles the way an experienced gambler does a coin, the type of gambler you don't bet against. The dagger was small with no hilt. It just had blunt spaces that allowed the man to hold onto it. He glared at another standing in front of him, analysing, calculating. The owner of the blade was as sharp as the edge that somehow never grazed his fingers as he delicately danced it in a mesmerising pattern, all the while never taking his rodent-like eyes off his prey. "He is pretty," he said, without interrupting the blade gliding through his hand. His voice had a high rasp to it, and his accent hinted that he did not spend all his time in Greywater, but he was born here. "Unfortunately, he looks like he bucks." "Who do you think you are?" the other man retorted, forgetting where he was for a moment. He did not like the inference of being another man's mare. Then he composed himself. The guy with the dagger was supposed to be able to smuggle anything, even people. The dagger snapped instantly, leaving the fingers it was dancing across only moments before. The blade sliced across the other man's face, coming within millimeters of his eye and drawing a strike of blood. "I am the weasel," he smiled, while another dagger continued the rhythm across his knuckles, appearing as if from nowhere. This was a gambler you did not bet against. "Testy, isn't he?" Faster than it had appeared, the second dagger was gone, as the weasel leaned forward in his chair. "Besides being pretty, why should I help you?" He squinted his eyes as he waited for a response. A motion that did nothing to remove the rodent-like idiosyncrasies. The man replied to the weasel, telling him who he was and his importance in the high society back in his home in Braston, the place he was now running from. What the man didn't understand is that none of that mattered now. He was a deserter. The Braston military had identified him as a person capable of tapping into onus magic. Regardless of how minute the bloodline of the tainted was pumping in this man's veins, the military would either recruit or execute him. The fact this man was now on the run proved that he was not wealthy or influential enough to manipulate the powers that be into ignoring his loss in the genetic lottery. The weasel shook his head and cut him off. He silently reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold coin. The weasel carefully placed it on the table for the deserter to see. The deserter stood in awe. Gold was more than uncommon. It was nigh on impossible to get your hands on, and many in Kowloon believed it a myth. The deserter's reaction to the rare element on the table was an exchange of information faster than words could have expressed. The weasel knew the man was from a wealthy background, or he wouldn't be standing in front of him in the first place. He assumed that he wasn't that wealthy, or he would not have needed to desert his family and be labelled a traitor to his country. But that also could have just meant he had pissed off the wrong people. The deserter's reaction to the gold confirmed he was not as wealthy as he pretended to be, so he was a liar as well. Not that that mattered. Good lies could be useful for all sorts of things, but the weasel had enough of them already. Alternately, the coin sitting on the table was all the information the deserter needed to realise he was not buying his way out of this situation. That coin was worth more than he could ever hope to accumulate. It also meant that the weasel, as he called himself, was far more than a deadly smuggler. A silence fell on them both as he tried to scramble for a reason that would justify the cost of this transaction. The gold coin was removed from the table and put back where it came from. "Kill him!" The weasel pointed towards the large burly man that was waiting in the corner. The deserter looked confused. The weasel was telling him to murder the man who brought him here. The burly man didn't flinch. Still, he stood unmoved, unsure of what to do. "Kill him for me," the weasel said again, demanding the deserter take some sort of direction. The deserter looked from the other man and back to the weasel, his mouth hung open in shock. "So, you aren't rich enough to buy me. You're a terrible liar. and you won't do my bidding. I'm afraid your time's run out. Kill him, the weasel said again. This time it was the deserter's death he was calling for. The deserter started babbling, throwing out everything he could think of or might be able to do for the weasel. Anything that would get him out of this place, anything to buy his life. But what was his life to a man that carried gold around in his pockets? Gold! As the burly man made his way towards the deserter, he drew a short sword. At this motion, the deserter's tongue started wagging. He tells of political information, who was fathering whose bastard child, naming traitors to the king's cause, anything he could think of that might grab the weasel's attention. The incessant noise spewing forth started to annoy the weasel, so he flicked his wrist, and in an instant the babbling was replaced by the gurgling of blood. One of his daggers now protruding from the deserter's neck. The burly man looked disappointed, but without a word sheathed his sword. Not breaking stride, he started dragging the not quite dead yet body out the door. The weasel pulled the gold coin back out of his pocket and analysed it, turning it over in front of his eyes. The value of the gold alone would put him in far better spaces than this. But the weasel had no love of fineries. He loved the game of it all. Plus, he needed to find a man that could tell him what the hell the runes written subtly on the edge of the coin meant.